This is a U.S.-China media brief produced by the UCLA Asian American Studies Center. The U.S.-China media brief features interviews with experts and other prominent individuals involved in studying and documenting the dynamic and ever-evolving relationship between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China. I'm Russell Leong, Director of the U.S.-China Media Brief of the UCLA Asian American Studies Center. Pleasure to talk with Professor Yoon Jung, convener of the Chinese in Africa, Africans in China Research Working Group, the Center for Sociological Research, University of Johannesburg, South Africa. Professor Park was born in Korea, grew up in California, and lived in Nairobi, Johannesburg since 1995. She received her PhD from the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa, and holds degrees from Pitzer College, Claremont, and Tufts University, Boston. She's a social scientist, and her areas of expertise are race and ethnicity, migration, identity studies, cultural studies, gender, and diversity. She is considered an authority on Chinese South Africans and new Chinese migrants in South Africa. Yoon is the newest member of our U.S.-China Media Brief Experts Exchange. So welcome, Yoon.
Thank you, Russell.
And welcome back to UCLA. And I'd like to start with just going back a little bit to when we first published Dr. Park's essay in Amerasia Journal in a special issue called Across the Color Line 2001. And she wrote a personal essay about her experience being an Asian in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could just talk a little bit about it and read something, a few lines.
When I was getting ready to leave South Africa to move to Kenya, I wanted to just reflect a little bit on what it was like, my experience as an Asian American living in Africa. So I'd started with the writing group that I was working on a piece that was very just reflective about my experience. And I had started my PhD research looking at the construction of ethnic, cultural, and political identity of the Chinese South Africans. And so I felt like it was a good time for me to start thinking about my own identity construction. And having grown up as an immigrant, Korean American, and then moving again to Africa and spending such a time there, it was timely. And Russell, who had been my supervisor when I did an internship here years ago when I was 20 at Amerasia, was interested and wanted to publish it. So let me just read a brief section here. An Asian American outside of America, Chinita or Gringa. Throughout the last 15 years, I've traveled extensively and lived in several different cities here in the U.S. and in Latin America and Africa. I've had homes in Seoul, Korea, Los Angeles, Cuernavaca, Mexico, Boston, San Jose, Costa Rica, Washington, D.C., Johannesburg, South Africa, and currently in Nairobi, Kenya. In each of these places, I found that my ethnic identity shifted and changed. When I lived in Mexico, where I went to learn Spanish and escape yuppidom, my ethnic identity as a Korean American didn't seem to be particularly relevant. In Mexico, it didn't really make any sense. I couldn't even find a way to say it in Spanish, soy Corea Americana, without sounding awkward. There were no bicultural, binational, or bi-ethnic terms like Asian American in Spanish. No one there asked you, what are you? Instead, they asked, where are you from? A question which, for me, has become progressively more and more difficult to answer. In my short answer, I explained that I was born in Korea, raised in the U.S. What was I when I was in Mexico if I wasn't a Korean American? Well, from behind, I looked like most Mexican women. Short, olive skin with dark straight hair. When I turned around, I became La Chinita, their generic term for all Asians. And when I opened my mouth, I became a gringa, an American. Perhaps because of the close and often strained relationship between Mexico and the United States, my Americanness was the most salient part of my identity to them. Similar issues about my ethnic, racial, and cultural identity came to the fore when I lived in South Africa. During these past 5 years, I've been called all kinds of things: Chinese, white, American, seldom have I been allowed to assert my Korean Americanness.
But you were telling me one time that in Africa you had to kind of demonstrate your alleged kung fu skills many times. Can you give us a demonstration or tell us about that?
I don't know karate or taekwondo or kung fu, but in Africa it is actually one of the most, I think, images that is lasting, and even now in terms of South African relations with China or African relations with China in general. For most Africans, the only kind of lasting impression they have of China or Chinese people has been through kung fu movies. So it's all about kung fu, karate, Bruce Lee. So it's not necessarily a negative image, but that is, or certainly was, when I first moved to South Africa, one of the impressions or expectations that anyone who looked like me would obviously know kung fu. So I had to give a demonstration once.
No gender bias, right? You applied for women as well. So
yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I guess Bruce Lee always had a female sidekick, so yeah.
And this kind of leads us, and we'd like to congratulate you actually on your new book, A Matter of Honor, Being Chinese in South Africa, published by Uschinamediabrief Media in May 2008, and also by Lexington Books here in the States, right? So maybe you can just tell us about how that book evolved and a little bit about it.
The book is based on my PhD dissertation, which I did on the construction of Chinese South African identity during the apartheid and the post-apartheid periods. And I think one of the reasons I chose this as a topic was because of my experiences as a Korean American living in South Africa. I was quite taken by the fact that the first few Chinese South Africans I met described themselves to me as Chinese. And when I probed a little bit, I asked, had you ever been to China? No. Do you speak Chinese? No. Well then why do you call yourself Chinese when you're clearly South African? And as I probed, most of the people that I had met were second, third, often fourth generation Chinese South African. And this got me interested in the impact of apartheid on the construction of this very particular identity. And it's a tiny community, a minority community of fewer than 10,000 individuals. But the book is based on the various kind of impacts that shaped Chinese South African identity, again, during the apartheid period. And interestingly, in the post-apartheid period, one of the biggest impacts has been new Chinese migration coming into Africa in the last 15 years, maybe 20 years if you include the Taiwanese who started coming in. And the fact that these Chinese South Africans who for years viewed themselves as Chinese but didn't speak the language, hadn't traveled there at all, were now for the first time in their lives confronted with real Chinese from China or from Taiwan, and it really upset the kind of comfortable construction of their Chineseness in interesting ways. So that's about where the book ends off, is looking at kind of the interactions now between Chinese South Africans, Taiwanese, and a large influx of new migration from mainland China.